So I'd like to do a little history, a brief history within economics as to how we got to where we are today. He mentioned there's an ambivalent answer in economics today, and why the treatment of altruism has so often occurred outside of economics. So I want to talk a little bit about this relation of self-interest and altruism. And then a brief note about a 19th century view of American culture from de Tocqueville, because there's a very interesting similarity, I think, between American culture and this tendency within economics. So let's begin a little history. Thinking back to John Stuart Mill, the great philosopher and economist and methodologist of economics in the 19th century, he started with the question of what should good scientific explanation be? And his view was that there's both induction and deduction, of course, but any mature science, he said, would be a deductive science. That when a science gets beginning, it's trying to use inductions, notice what's happening and make a generalization. But once you're mature, you have the generalizations, like physics, and you know the law of gravity, and you go around trying to apply it, and you can explain any event that can be deduced from the general principle that you already know to be true. And so it's quite a respectable thing, arguing from a deduction, even though he's absolutely convinced that all knowledge comes from induction originally. But when he comes now to social science, he notices that social complexity is so great. There are so many causes that are mixed together, and they have so many different effects that intermix, that you were going to have to use deduction, even though it's not a mature science left yet. And so we need a general principle from which we can deduce things and then be able to explain anything which can thereby be deduced. So he says political economy must start with these general principles, and an economic event is explained if it can be deduced from those principles it starts with. So where do they come from? Well, we have to borrow these from the outside, he says. He says political economy borrows from the pure science of mind the laws of the phenomena of mind which are concerned with production and distribution. So economists don't generate these principles, they get them from, we would say, the equivalent of psychology. Of course, this is 50 years before Freud. There is no discipline of psychology yet. And so he says the starting point for political economy is to consider mankind as occupied solely in the acquiring and consuming of wealth, and aims at showing what is the course of action if that motive were the absolute ruler of all their actions. So economics, political economy, was to begin with the presumption that people are trying to create more wealth and use it. Now, he was quite aware, of course, that people have many other points of view besides just making more wealth. And so he acknowledges the unrealism of this. He says no political economist was ever so absurd as to suppose that mankind are really thus constituted. But this is the mode in which science must necessarily proceed, because we have to have this deductive process. And so he uses this one principle and two others. He mentions aversion to hard work and the delight in luxurious consumption, both of which are going to work against our wanting to increase our wealth. But those are the three items that economists are going to focus on. So what are the implications of this? Well, on the one hand, economics studies only part of life. Altruism, thus, is outside of economics as a discipline, and this is necessary given the structure of science, and it also means something else, that economists can provide information to public policy makers only about the effects of this wealth-seeking and the other two motivations, and not about all human motivation. And so, of course, number three, only the legislator and not the economist has enough knowledge to decide about public policy. There's a humility built into political economy, as Mill sees it, because the public policy, the legislator or the king, will rely on economics and many other sciences to get the information needed to make a good policy decision, as we would put it. So that's step one. Step two comes with William Stanley Jevons in 1871, and Jevons was the Englishman on this side of the channel. There were two others on the continent who is given credit for inventing what we today call marginal utility theory. And this is the model of human decision-making, quite familiar to intermediate micro classes all over the United States, that understands decision-making as a kind of mathematical function, applying the calculus, and we begin talking about maximizing utility. And so we have a certain mathematical elegance to this, and it's a remarkably brilliant idea, frankly, in the history of ideas, because it solves what has historically been called the diamond water paradox, which is to say we know water is far more important than diamonds, but we're willing to pay far more for diamonds than we're willing to pay for water. And why is that? And I will not walk through that. It's a wonderful idea if you haven't run into that before. But the point I want to make here, though, is that even though this has now become utility maximization, Jevons does not come to where we are today, because he says economics is still limited to what he calls the lowest rank of feeling. And so he says economics is going to be subordinate. He said there's a higher calculus of moral right and wrong which would be needed to show how a man may best employ his wealth for the good of others as well as for himself. But that's outside of what economics, political economy, will do. But he says, but when that higher calculus gives no prohibition, we need the lower calculus to gain us the utmost good in matters of moral indifference. So he quite clearly sees economics as a discipline as only part of human knowledge, and in this sense agrees with Mill that economists give technical policy advice, but certainly shouldn't think that they know what legislators should do based on economics alone. So this is basically the neoclassical synthesis that is together in the 1870s. That economic events are explained by the analysis of demand and supply. Every market has a demand curve and a supply curve. Market demand is the sum of what individuals demand at various prices. In other words, the market demand curve is the sum of individual demand curves. I won't go to the supply side, but it's the same thing is true there. The market supply curve is the sum of all the individual supply curves of all the producers. And there's a marginal productivity theory that traces us all back to their profit maximization. So this is the neoclassical synthesis. And individuals then decide how much of each product to demand based on the marginal utility theory. Given their budget constraint, they make the best choices they can given their goals. And the same is true for producers on the other side. And this is the basic model that is in place in the 1870s that still is the basic model for most microeconomics classes today. Now, what does that mean? Well, economic events are explained by tracing them back to the decisions of utility maximizing consumers and profit maximizing producers. This is the fundamental model of economics. How do you know when you've explained something? You trace it back to these people who made the decisions. And general equilibrium analysis tries to give an overall view of that. And so the outcomes of a perfectly competitive market deserve moral approval, although this is not claimed as an economist, but because, in fact, they are generated by the decisions of these individuals as consumers and producers. And this becomes a very powerful moral endorsement of markets, because we can trace them back to the individuals, and where else would we find values? Of course, this is a group that's not wanting to turn to natural law or some sort of external set of norms. It's the people involved. So this is a wonderful synthesis, but it gets called into question in the 20th century. So Lionel Robbins is another, I should say this is a brief overview. There are a lot of other people who should be mentioned here that aren't going to get mentioned. But so Robbins in 1935, he expands economics to the definition we generally have today. Economics is the science which studies human behavior as a relationship between ends and scarce means which have alternative uses. And we find this in almost every economics textbook today. Economics studies this process. But it's an expansion of economics because it's no longer about economic life, it's about all human choice. Anytime we're making a choice, we have a goal or multiple goals, we have insufficient means, which is the human condition, we're going to be studying that kind of behavior in economics. And so economics no longer needs to import principles from other social sciences if we understand ourselves as capable ourselves of analyzing all these decision-making, including that of the legislator. So there's a real expansion of economics that goes on in this way. But Paul Samuelson is next, and he's going to oversee a contraction of economics in one important way. And that is that by this time, of course, there is a Department of Psychology on campus, and the psychologists have told us for decades, your model is nothing like what people really do. How can you possibly think this is good psychology? So economists now know nothing about what goes on inside the human mind, and so marginal utility theory has no justification in economics. It was assumed to be imported by Mill from the sciences of the day, but now has been discredited by our colleagues across campus. It's pretty hard to hold your head up on campus when you claim something is true empirically when they know it's not. And so what does Paul Samuelson do? Here he is, young man in his 30s. He develops revealed preference theory. And this assumes that the consumer can express a preference between any two bundles of goods. I can offer you this group of goods or that, and as long as you can tell me which one you prefer, and as long as that can happen for any two bundles of goods, no matter how complicated they are, then we don't need the utility theory. All the demand analysis can be mathematically supported simply based on the assumption people can make these choices. And of course, included there are things like consistency, that we don't change our mind from the beginning of the experiment to the end, and we know that happens. That we have completeness. We can name any two bundles of goods, even if this one has hand grenades and strawberries, and this one has two other remarks, that we can do that. And of course, transitivity, that if I prefer A to B and B to C, then I would never prefer C to A, because I must be preferring A to C. Now, of course, we know there's a real problem here for a number of reasons. People don't have those mathematical functions, those traits, and psychologists pointed this out right away. But the thing it's done is it no longer, as economists, do we claim any insight into the psyche. We're simply claiming that if people can make choices, admittedly with some unrealistic assumptions about the choices, that we can then support our huge, wonderful mathematical theory, which is really an important part of the science. So what's the outcome? Well, the mainstream economic paradigm now claims to know nothing about human psychology, because, of course, economists have no insight into that. And yet claims to understand human behavior as the relation between our goals and the scarce means we have to achieve them, which is, again, in every introductory textbook. So how is it that we could talk about goals and the means we choose to meet them if we know nothing about the psyche? We have here a growing incoherence in the discipline. And there's a real problem. Is this revealed preference theory actually realistic? Can people really make these choices? So the last figure I want to talk to here in economics is Milton Friedman, a professor of mine back in the early 1970s, a wonderful teacher. And he comes up with something that the philosophers of science call instrumentalism. And his claim is that the ultimate goal of any positive science, and that's what he wants economics to be, is the development of a theory or hypothesis that yields valid and meaningful predictions about phenomena yet to be observed. So the function of economics, or any good science, is to make predictions. No longer really to make explanations, although that sort of creeps in there. But if you read his essay, the word explanation does not appear once in this essay on positive economics. And when he uses the word explain, it's often in quotes, to explain something in quotes, as if indicating that there's something squishy about the claim to explain things. What we're really about is to predict things. And so, again, I don't know if this was his intention, but it certainly is a way of trying to avoid a whole series of problems that were there beforehand, if you can say prediction. And why is that? Because he says that truly important and significant hypotheses will be found to have assumptions that are wildly inaccurate. They're not good descriptions of reality. And one of his examples was, we assume in physics the law of gravity we talk about a perfect vacuum, but of course that doesn't exist. And yet physicists get away with this, and it hasn't got to be realistic. And so he really spends most of his time on the theory of the firm in this essay. And the assumption there is that firms are maximizing their profit, even though there's no empirical evidence from psychology or management that that's what managers really do. There are a lot of other things they do besides maximize their profit. But he says it doesn't matter as long as it gives you good predictions. And so this is his attempt to solve this problem. But there are problems with his solution. Because both in his classes and in his writings, Friedman always argued for the plausibility of the self-interest / maximization assumption. He never wrote an essay, a paper in his life, to my knowledge, that didn't include what we call nowadays a story about how people are realistically making rational decisions that bring this outcome. So in theory, all he's interested in is in the predictions, but in practice, he always includes the plausibility of the claim that people are rationally maximizing in their decisions. Yet when challenged that his assumption of rational maximization is untrue, he falls back on the assertion that the assumptions don't really need to be true, and so it's not really a problem. So we're left with this difficulty in economics, and I think many economists have it and do this. Right? On the one hand, we really sort of believe the utility maximization model, and we analyze a lot of things that way, even though we know we don't have grounds for grounding that in psychology. And when we have to, we say, well, it doesn't really matter. It's just a heuristic device. So if we ask this question, is altruism self-interested? The usual answer is, well, self-interest is not necessarily selfish. That's another typical part of the utility analysis. We've heard it a few times here. And that is to say, whatever is in my utility function is what I'm trying to maximize, and Mother Teresa has a different utility function than the felon, the thief in Calcutta, who goes around ripping off the poor while she tries to help them. But this means that both Mother Teresa and the felon are maximized in their utility. So what does this do? Well, it makes invisible what for most people in ordinary life is a very important difference between these two people. Namely, one is a person we look up to and one we don't, right? And this becomes invisible. So what's the difficulty here? Well, one is that this is a tautology. If a person could not possibly do anything that would prove that they're not maximizing utility, then utility theory is vacuous, at least according to Karl Popper's standard for good scientific analysis. And as we've heard a couple times in our meetings, it's pretty typical for economists to take anything anybody might do, including the GI who jumps on the grenade to help his friends, as a maximizing of his utility. So in one sense, it's tautological or vacuous. But either way we go about it, altruism becomes pretty much invisible if we cannot distinguish Mother Teresa from the felon. So we have this eclipse of both vice and virtue. But then we're left with the problem, could we not say that any discipline that cannot make a distinction between Mother Teresa and the felon, based on some conception of what's good for human beings, would be on thin ice claiming authority in public policy discussions? So even though economists claim that we study all decisions, no matter what, not just in economic life, but all parts of life, if we don't have any information on what goes on in people's heads, what a theory of the good is, how is it that economists would ever dare to say something like, economics says we should pass this law? Where can that come from? So let me just take one simple example here, the proposal going on now to raise the minimum wage to $10.10. The Congressional Budget Office, about as nonpartisan a group as we can get these days, at least both sides pay the salaries, and they argue that there'll be probably about 500,000 jobs lost, about 0.3% of all the jobs in the country. Now, for this reason, there are many economists who are publicly opposed to raising the minimum wage, because it's clearly a loss. But the CBO found two other effects. 900,000 people will be moved out of poverty, about 2% of all those in poverty, and about 16.5 million workers will get a higher weekly earnings, about 13% of all workers. So if we understand this change in the law to have these three effects and probably others, and of course any one of these numbers could be debated, but we know that there'll be at least these three effects of some magnitude. How could any one of us as a technical economist take a position on whether this law is a good thing to pass or not? We have to evaluate the weights of these three things, and there's nothing in economics that allows us to do that. And even though economists often claim on economic grounds to have positions. A way to put this even more dramatically is, why not reduce the minimum wage by $3 and nobody's done the math, but let's presume it were the same, would it be a good idea to create 500,000 jobs and put 900,000 people in poverty and reduce the income of 16.5 million? I mean, it's really the same kind of question, and could economics as a discipline take a position on this? So there's a fundamental incoherence in the discipline about these matters. Policymakers are assumed that they should do as economists say because of the values of economic insight, but officially, economics can say nothing about what goes inside the heads of people, and it cannot distinguish between vice and virtue, good and bad. So economics provides deep insight into much of what goes on in economic life, and many people have asserted that this year, and I think it's absolutely true. It's an absolutely critical discipline for public policy. But economics ignores fundamental parts of what most people value, like everyday difference between selfishness and altruism. And this should lead to a kind of greater humility in public policy than we typically show as a discipline. Well, let me just look briefly at Alexis de Tocqueville, this Frenchman who actually a year before Mill's essay that I talked about made this comment about American self-interest rightly understood. He said, Americans do not deny that every man may follow his own interests, but they endeavor to prove that it is in the interest of every man to be virtuous. In the interest of every man to be virtuous. So we ask, what does that mean? Could we rightly understand self-interest rightly understood? And I'd say there are two options, basically. One is, this is simply long-term calculation of narrow self-interest. I'm going to look out for your interest because it's going to serve my interest, and that's why I'm doing it. But we would call that egoism, and not many people want to endorse that. The other option is, my narrow self-interest just happens by coincidence to be served as a byproduct of my authentic concern for your well-being. And that's conceivable, but likely. The Christian story would be, no, for me to be concerned about you may cost me dearly, right? We have Jesus as the example, right? So this is an empirical claim that just doesn't seem to be true. So if the principle of self-interest, as rightly understood, were to hold sway, this is what de Tocqueville said, in the whole world, extraordinary virtues would doubtless be more rare. There'd be less altruism in the world. But I think the gross depravity would also be less common. That is to say, there'd be fewer people out there just dog eat dog, because they have this illusion that their own interests are served if they help other people. So in a sense, this American cultural piece and the economic piece together, I think, is based on what I would call a triple delusion. Two empirical delusions. The first is that serving first the interest of others does in fact serve one's own interest. That's true sometimes. A lot of times it's not true. The second, which I haven't really talked about here tonight, but it's sort of the modern distortion of Adam Smith's invisible hand, the belief that seeking one's own interest in a free market leads to prosperity for all. This is also a delusion. Lots of constraints have to be on the market before that can, everything from no murder of your competitors to helping out the poor and all the rest. And then one moral delusion, that it's morally praiseworthy to serve the interest of others, even if your only intention is to further your own interests. This is not morally praiseworthy, but it's implicit in this notion of self-interest, rightly understood, which is why I think it's not a very good justification for our market system, even though it's employed by many neoconservative Catholics, like Michael Novak and others, as a defense of the market system. So this is the last slide. So both mainstream economic science and American culture possess an incoherent understanding of the relation of self-interest and altruism, and of the moral life more generally, of course. I'm sorry, there it is on the screen. Unfortunately, the incoherence of each lends popularity to the incoherent view of the other. And I think that's part of our problem in sorting out the relation of theology and economics today. Now, obviously, Catholic social thought has a lot to say about this, but that would be another talk for another day. Thank you.